Picture this: Halloween morning in Martin, Ohio. The streets are lined with pumpkins. Kids are plotting their candy raids, and one family's house holds a secret that no costume can disguise. It's supposed to be a day of tricks and treats, but what's brewing inside the Liske household is far more terrifying than anything you'd find in a haunted house. Blended family tensions, fights that escalate beyond words, and then, on one fateful morning, a discovery that sends a small town spiraling into horror. A missing brother, a locked room, and an alibi that involves choir robes, of all things. And the deeper you dig, the darker it gets. Today, we're diving into the Liske family murders, a story that turns Halloween into a true horror show. Buckle up, because the scariest part of this tale isn't the tricks, it's the truth. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder. This was the most disturbing murder scene I'd ever seen over the course of my career. A state prosecutor would later describe the case he had just been a part of. I can still see it to this day. The case in question was one that would shake the small, close-knit community of Martin, Ohio, and would spread unprecedented fear through the hearts and homes on a day that is supposed to be filled with tricks and treats. It all started when a couple named William and Susan Liske married back in 2001. This wasn't the first time down the aisle for either of them, and both of them were bringing their own children from previous marriages into this new blended family. Susan had two sons, Devin and Derek, and William had one, whose name was William Jr., although he usually went by his nickname, BJ. Devin and Derek seemed to adapt well to this new life and having William Sr. in their lives. But unfortunately, the same could not be said for William's son, BJ. BJ didn't take too well to having a stepmother, and continuous fights between him and Susan would often leave William Sr. having to pick between his new wife and his son. All of this tension would come to a head on Sunday, October 31st, 2010, when one member of the Liske family would make a gruesome and earth-shattering discovery. William's sister, Lori Morris, and her husband had asked 23-year-old Derek to come around that morning to do some work for them. Derek had agreed, but when he didn't show up, Lori called Derek. When Derek didn't answer, she called Susan, and when Susan didn't answer, she called Devin. When Devin answered, Lori had finally managed to get through to someone in the Liske household, but unfortunately, Devin didn't have much information to give her. Devin had spent the night before at his father's house and had only come home on Sunday morning to grab his choir robes and head straight back out to perform in a concert at the local church. When he returned from that concert, he'd headed straight into his room. The house was unusually quiet for a Sunday, but Devin didn't think much of it at the time. He'd actually welcomed the opportunity to sit in his room and play video games undisturbed for a few hours. But as the day drew on and no one else seemed to come home, or to even start getting ready for the trick-or-treaters that were sure to come around later that evening, Devin began to feel uneasy. He went into William's and Susan's room and found them in bed, sleeping, the covers pulled up over their heads. He put a hand out to Susan and gave her a shake, but Susan didn't wake up. Concerned, Devin then pulled the covers down to find something that no child should ever have to see. Immediately, Devin started screaming. Then, screaming and crying, he ran straight out of the house and took off down the street. It took him a good few minutes just to calm down enough to think about what he should do next, and then, still completely panicked, he called his aunt and told her everything he'd just seen. Shocked and concerned about her nephew, his aunt then called the police on Devin's behalf and told him to sit tight and wait for first responders to arrive. Within minutes, law enforcement had secured the scene, and they began the long and gruesome task of piecing everything together. At some point, either the night before or during that very morning, while Devin was either with his father or at church, someone had attacked the Liske family. William had been shot in the head and face multiple times, leaving blood spatter on the walls and soaking the bed underneath his body. Susan's fate was even worse. Susan had first been sexually assaulted before she'd been shot in the head too. Both victims would be found side by side in their bed. The question then turned to Devon's older brother, Derek. He'd also been in the home the night before, and it was very unlikely that he wouldn't have heard the gunshots from William and Susan's room. The investigators then approached Derek's room and found the door locked. It had been locked from the inside, suggesting that Derek had locked himself in. Maybe he'd done so to hide from William and Susan's killer. Maybe he was the one who'd actually attacked them, and now he was hiding from the police. Law enforcement broke down the door and forced their way into Derek's room. But instead of finding the person who'd killed William and Susan, they found that Derek was actually another victim. He was on his bed, curled up, almost like he'd been trying to protect himself. And he'd been murdered too. This time the killer struck with a blunt object, leaving a sizable wound on Derek's head that ended up killing him. In one fell swoop, Devon had lost his mother, his older brother, and his stepfather. Distraught and visibly shaken, Devon was then brought to the station to give an interview. This talk with the investigators had many motives behind it. The first was that Devon had actually been the one to discover the bodies, and therefore was the closest thing the investigators had at the moment to a witness. But Devon was also a suspect. Yes, he'd been at his father's house the night before, but the Liske family home had given the investigators more than one reason for them to believe that the killings had been an inside job. The home itself showed no signs of forced entry, meaning that the killer more than likely had their own way of getting into the house or had already been inside it. There were no signs of a struggle or that the home had been burglarized, suggesting that the killer had known their way around and had come there for the sole purpose of killing them. Another discovery was quickly made that seemed to support that theory. Despite the fact that one of the murder weapons had been a gun, no bullet casings were found at the scene. Whoever killed William, Susan, and Derek had cleaned up after themselves, suggesting that they had at the very least put some degree of thought or planning into the killings themselves. The investigators first turned to Devon to try to figure out if he was capable of killing his own family. But Devon's version of events and his alibi remained consistent. He'd been at his father's the night before and had only come home Sunday morning to pick up his choir robes and head straight back out to the concert. He had, however, seen one more person at the house that morning, and he was quite the unexpected house guest. William's son, BJ, had spent the night at the Liskes. In fact, he and William had just come back from a week-long hunting trip together at the family cabin out in the woods. When he and William came home that Saturday night, William and Susan invited BJ to stay after a get-together they'd hosted that night after it turned into a bit of a party and then led to some drinking. BJ himself was not actually a member of the Liske household anymore. He had been at first, but the relationship between him and Susan had deteriorated to the point where BJ had been asked to leave the house. The paper trail to prove that started back in 2004 when a police report indicated that BJ had hit his stepmother with a coffee mug. 2 months after that, he'd punched her in the chest. A short while after that, he'd stolen the car keys and attacked her with them. After one of these violent outbursts, the local police came in and then physically removed BJ from the house. He was then sent to a mental facility where he stayed until William Sr. came in and agreed to be BJ's guardian. After that, BJ wasn't allowed back into the house, but William was doing his best to rebuild his relationship with his son and to keep their blended family together. That was actually why he and BJ had gone out on that hunting trip, and that was another reason why William offered for BJ to sleep on the sofa after they'd all enjoyed themselves at the party afterward. The following morning, while Devon was at the house picking up his robe, he saw BJ out on the front of the house putting something into his white truck. Devon explained that he was on his way to church and told BJ that he would be back soon, but when he came back afterward, BJ had already left. This piece of evidence and the long and difficult relationship that BJ had between his father and his stepmother led to a countrywide manhunt. While the investigators back at the scene were busy finding the claw hammer that had been used to kill Derek, law enforcement were at the Liske family cabin, arresting the man who had used it. BJ didn't put up a fight, and around him was only one more piece of physical evidence to prove that he had actually been the one to kill his father, stepmother, and stepbrother. All of their DNA was found on BJ and in his truck, and so was the .22 caliber rifle that had been used to kill both Susan and William. BJ agreed to a plea deal, which spared him the death penalty. He agreed to plead guilty to the 3 murders in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His life would be spared, but he would actually only serve a year of his sentence. In 2011, BJ took his own life and was found dead in his prison cell. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for listening. Let's get to a quick email. Hi, Joe. I have a question. Do you read? Aggressive right from the beginning. Sounds like it could be hate mail, but let's continue. The way you tell stories on your podcast, I like how they're detailed almost like a novel. It makes me think that you probably read a lot. If you do, what are you reading now and what can you recommend? Big fan, Noel. Well, first of all, Noel, Merry Christmas. Second, yes, I read. Sometimes I read with my eyes, other times with my ears. Audiobooks. And yes, that still counts, in case you're wondering. I've just started a book called The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. It's too soon to say if I'd recommend it, because I just started it, but I would recommend The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. It's a psychological thriller with a bunch of twists. Some of them you see coming, but overall, a super good book. And the reason I'm recommending that is because it's currently being adapted into a movie starring Sydney Sweeney and Amanda Seyfried. Is that how you say that? It's a movie based on the book. I always like to read the book first and then see the movie afterwards. So I've read the book. It's good. So I'm really interested to see the movie. And again, Noel, thank you for your email. If you would like to email me, you can do that. joe@10minutemurder.com. You can go to the website, 10minutemurder.com. There you'll find the way that you can email me, links to every place that you can find this podcast, and a blog is there. If you're a brand new listener to the podcast, couple things I need you to do. First of all, very important, subscribe to this podcast wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And then follow on social media. That's step 1 and 2. Now, if you want to advance to the next level, be an OG listener, catch up on all the back episodes, and share this podcast with your friends and family. And that's it. And that is your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder.